Grim and immediate, the 1140s, the English countryside was reduced to a landscape of burning fields, displaced civilians, and crude timber fortresses. The condition of the country stood in sharp contrast to the state of the kingdom just a decade earlier. In 1135, England operated as one of the most highly centralized, efficiently administered corporate states in Europe under King Henry I. Henry managed a strictly controlled bureaucratic machine. It was defined by a massive royal treasury, a standardized system of justice, and the crown's absolute monopoly on the minting of silver currency. That state machinery halted in 1135 when Henry died unexpectedly. In the ensuing succession crisis, his nephew Stephen of Blois quickly crossed the English Channel to seize the throne. By bypassing the planned succession of Henry's daughter, the Empress Matilda, Stephen fractured the Anglo-Norman nobility. The elite split into rival factions, and central authority evaporated almost overnight. The 19-year civil war of the Anarchy functioned as a rapid, catastrophic privatization of violence. When a central government loses its monopoly on force, the state degrades into localized warlordism. The civilian population becomes a resource to be extracted by anyone with a sword and a castle. The collapse began in the royal treasury. By 1138, King Stephen had completely drained the massive financial reserves accumulated by his uncle. The surplus was exhausted on maintaining lavish courts to purchase the loyalty of wavering barons and paying for foreign mercenaries required for regional wars. This map illustrates the resulting economic fracture. Without a central surplus, centralized taxation networks shattered into dozens of isolated regional economies. The most immediate casualty was the royal monopoly on currency. Local leaders could no longer rely on the crown to supply coinage. Bishops, rival claimants, and regional lords, acting as robber barons, began striking their own debased, illegal silver coins to pay their private troops. This loss of financial control neutralized legal control. Royal justice courts collapsed across the countryside. There was no central authority left to enforce rulings. Royal forest laws were ignored. Barons poached timber and game from protected crown lands with impunity. The evaporation of federal law and money transferred de facto political authority directly to independent warlords. This localized authority required a physical headquarters, giving rise to the defining structure of the conflict, the Adulterine castle. Adulterine simply means unauthorized. The king traditionally retained the right to approve new castle construction, but in the chaos, local lords built fortifications without permission. This diagram demonstrates the scale of the construction boom. The contemporary chronicler Robert of Torigny estimated that up to 1,115 of these unauthorized castles were erected during the war. These fortifications lacked the grand stone architecture and strategic permanence of royal defensive strongholds. Lords utilized crude earthwork and timber structures as militarized toll booths and hubs for raiding parties to extort grain and silver from local peasants. As crude as they were highly effective. Early tension-powered siege engines, like mangonels, were too weak to breach thick earthworks and timber palisades.
Because commanders could not quickly storm these defenses, their primary tactical response was to build a second fortification right next to it, a counter-castle designed purely to blockade the enemy. This aerial view shows the earthworks of a counter-castle built near a main fortress. Placed just beyond bow range, it cut off enemy supply lines to force slow starvation. That attritional grind meant warfare during the Anarchy was a brutal waiting game, fought in freezing, miserable conditions. The prevailing military doctrine of the 1140s dictated that prudent commanders should avoid pitched open-field battles where the risk of capture or death was extremely high. The preferred alternative was to systematically raid rival estates, burn civilian crops, and surround castles to slowly starve the defenders out. The ultimate case study occurred in 1142 during the Siege of Oxford, trapping Empress Matilda. Matilda retreated into Oxford Castle's St. George's Tower. Unable to breach its walls, Stephen waited in the freezing mud for her supplies to run out. But just before Christmas, the Empress sneaked out. Wearing white to camouflage against the snow, she escaped on foot past the royal army. Her escape highlights the porous nature of overextended medieval siege lines. Armies struggling to survive in freezing camps simply could not maintain an airtight blockade. This logistical misery was compounded by both sides relying heavily on expensive foreign troops, like the Flemish mercenaries commanded by Stephen's lieutenant, William of Ypres. These mercenaries had no stake in English dynastic politics. They fought exclusively for pay and plunder, indiscriminately raiding the countryside and maximizing local suffering. Weak siege technology, the logistical nightmare of winter blockades, and troops motivated only by pillage meant neither side could secure a decisive advantage. The war became a multi-decade stalemate. By the late 1140s, large portions of England were devastated. The landscape was littered with ruined fields and the rotting frames of abandoned castles. Major military campaigns gradually ceased. The war did not end with a decisive battlefield victory, but through mutual financial, logistical, and environmental exhaustion. A grassroots peace movement took hold among the nobility. Powerful barons began ignoring both royal factions, signing private truces and disarmament agreements with each other to protect their surviving estates. This exhaustion forced the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153, an agreement brokered by a war-weary church and a nobility that refused to finance the conflict any longer. Under the treaty's terms, Stephen retained the throne for the rest of his life, but he legally recognized Matilda's son, Henry, as his successor, finally ending the succession crisis.
The resolution of the anarchy came after 19 years of severe trauma, captured in manuscripts of the era. The Peterborough Chronicle recorded the population's despair, stating, "Men said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep." The collapse of central authority reveals that state power rests on a monopoly of violence. Without it, society defaults to the mechanics of extortion, attrition, and the rule of the local warlord.